going to talk about morality tonight, so y'all better be on your best behavior. But I think this is a subject that comes up with social media. There are some new challenges to Christian morality from social media, and we're going to talk about that this evening. And one of the contributing factors to it is the absence of FCC regulations on the internet. Just a little quick history lesson here. In 1934, the government established the Federal Communications Commission, better known as the FCC, to regulate, basically ethics and morality on the airwaves. Now, in 1934, what did that include? Radio and the silver screen, right? I think that's about all that people had as far as broadcast entertainment options in those days. Soon after that, maybe a couple decades, came television, and the FCC had control over television. And maybe some other entertainment options were covered by that. But things changed with the internet, right? The FCC does not currently regulate the internet. Proposals have been made to do that kind of thing, but the internet's a totally different animal than broadcast communications. For one thing, it's global, so it crosses international lines, and it's not as easy to control. For another thing, it's a matter of free speech, whereas broadcast communications is very centralized. We call that mass media. Internet is controlled democratically, by the people. It's passed along from person to person. Anybody with an internet connection can start a blog or have a social media account or anything and pass information around and share information around. That's kind of what we've been talking about here. So how does the government control that without crushing the First Amendment and challenging free speech? So there are, of course, blessings and curses that go along with not having the FCC interfere. What are some of the good things that come about from this unregulated media that we have through the internet? Think about it, and we've talked about some of the good things. What are some good things?
Creativity.
There's more creativity. You have more people able to contribute their ideas and share them and grow them, and so you have open source software and open source things like Wikipedia that is very creative sometimes and also can be useful sometimes. What else? Yeah, Jimmy.
More immediate knowledge of the news through crowdsourcing.
Yes.
Now, it's not necessarily always accurate, but at least you're aware of it, and then when it's
instant.
But when somebody actually does go out there and make sure that it is accurate, then at least you knew about it in advance and could take action.
A lot of times what you see on broadcast news is reports of what was first seen on the internet. So that makes your point. Anything else?
We were shooting through the internet before it was even on the news.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah. What else? In countries where the government is very tyrannical, where they keep a stranglehold on the people and try to control, for decades have tried to control mass media, the internet has been a relief to oppressed people. Minorities and people who don't have a voice suddenly are able to get the word out, and that's why countries like China, North Korea, and Russia and others have put some restrictions on social media, closed down social media sites and try to control it, because the internet gets the truth out there in ways that couldn't be done 20, 30 years ago. So that's a positive thing. And you hear about, whether you see news stories today, like is Iran going to allow people to have Facebook or whatever? And that's because that country has been very oppressive, and they want to control the people. And the internet has a way of letting ideas out that the government doesn't want out there, and that's a positive thing. But obviously, it's a two-edged sword, right? What are some of the negative things?
A lot of the same things you just said.
Yeah, I was about to make that same joke. Is the positive is anything can get out. The negative is anything can get out. And so you have, before social media, we were already talking about the plague of pornography, the access of all kinds of information that should be kept top secret. You can look at Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and those kinds of things. And so it is a two-edged sword. The good things are also the bad things. It comes down to information. The internet's neutral. It allows information to flow. Some of the information is good information we need to know. Some of the information is bad information that we don't need to know. And that's what it boils down to. So that introduces this subject of morality or immorality, depending on if you're a glass is half empty or half full kind of person. And parents are already starting to notice that there's a lot of immorality out there in social media specifically, not just the internet. Parents in the UK have started to notice that social media is interfering with their children's moral development. And here's some of the things a recent study has found. 60%, these are the parents that have been noticing things, 60% said they had seen anger or hostility in their children's social media activity. 51% said they had seen arrogance. 41% said they saw bad judgment. 36% said that they had seen hatred. The vast majority of these parents had noticed a huge absence of humility, self-control, forgiveness, honesty, and fairness on these social media platforms. So these aren't usually the areas that we think about when we think about immorality. And we're going to talk about some of those areas we usually think about. But this is dangerous stuff too, right? Especially this list here, the anger and hostility and arrogance. All of these are anti-Christian ideas, and they need to be taken as seriously as some of the others. We often just kind of look at the problem of sexual immorality or, things that are perverse in nature, and that's a problem too. But so is this, and social media has become a breeding ground for hatred. And this is something that a lot of parents are concerned about, and we should be concerned about it too. So what's the solution? Well, parents may say, hey, I'll just get a social media account and I'll snoop on my kids. But kids are smarter than parents in a lot of ways, and there are some ways to get around that. And one of them is Snapchat, and there are some others now. You have to stay updated on this all the time, and I haven't been as vigilant as I should be on some of these other apps and social media platforms that try to get around parents wanting to know what their kids are into. But Snapchat was the first, came along in 2011 as a way for kids to hide things, basically. And people will argue with that, but if you're familiar with Snapchat's platform, basically what it does is it disappears your posts in, 15 seconds? So what's the usefulness of that? There's only one utility of that, and that is to hide what you post from other people. It's the social media platform with disappearing posts. So you don't want anything to disappear unless you're trying to hide it from somebody. Now, one of the many, many problems with this is you're not really sure that anything's being hidden because the person on the other end can take a screenshot of whatever you send, and it's there forever. And people have started to discover this, making an indiscreet photo or making a bad decision or posting something about the boss only to find on Snapchat only to find that it got out through a screenshot, and everybody's talking about it at work the next day. So this has been a problem, and if you've got teenagers using this, my suggestion would be just tell them to stop using it. But if they use it, they need to understand that nothing is temporary. Everything is potentially permanent, even on Snapchat. So it's not as easy as just being able to snoop, although by all means, snoop on your kids as much as possible. But also don't be naive into thinking that they don't know how to hide stuff from you, because they do. Teenagers, by definition, are very, very good at hiding things from their parents, and we don't need to be naive about that. We've talked about, in this class, keeping something secret. Okay? Keeping your dignity through your secrets and not posting everything about your private life for everybody to see. But there are other things that need to be brought to light. You know, the church, we talked about this, is a safe place for accountability to occur. We need to confess our sins to one another. We need to have friends that we share stuff with. And Jesus talked about this in John 3. I want us to look at John 3, verses 20 and 21. We usually stop at verse 16, but John 3 has a lot of good verses in it. And I'll actually start reading at verse 19 of John 3. This is the judgment. The light is come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works are evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. So we shouldn't be trying to hide certain parts of our life because we're ashamed of them. When it comes to morality, it's good to have accountability measures and to stay away from things that hide, like Snapchat. That's just a dangerous area to go into. Now, there's a lot of areas to talk about here, and I had to choose because there's only so much time. So we're going to look at 3 areas of morality that should be of concern to us as we use social media. Please understand there are more, and then maybe we'll have a little time at the end of class. You can throw out some of the other areas of concern. But I want to talk about 3 in particular before our time's up. And this one goes back to the UK study I talked about a minute ago. Hatred and cruelty. Just as an example, earlier this year, and I didn't know this guy, I just learned about him through the headlines, but this guy with 18 million YouTube subscribers named Logan Paul posted a video. He evidently is a YouTube star. That's a thing these days. He posted a video of visiting the suicide forest in Japan, and he found the body of somebody who had committed suicide and showed the body in his video and laughed about it and made light of it, which is a horrendous thing for this guy to do. And he came back, of course, because of the public outcry and apologized for it. But you think about this, this isn't the first time this guy's done something cruel and inhumane like that. There's just no soul in a person like that. And what's scary is that he has 18 million subscribers. And people really like that. And he's still probably making money and still has his YouTube channel and still lived through that. But the hatred and cruelty that somebody's capable of who can do something like that kind of illustrates the problem here. There's something about social media that brings out the worst in us. And I think some of it has to do with forgetting that there are real people on the other side of things, and forgetting that forgetting empathy, and that, you know, empathy is that discipline that we've talked about in other classes as well. Just to remind you of some of the things we've already studied, God sets a high value on humanity. He made us in His image, according to Genesis chapter 1, and He crowned us with glory and honor, as David says in Psalm 8, verse 5. He sent Jesus to die for us. So He paid the ultimate price for us. That must mean we're very valuable in the eyes of God. I don't see anything Christian or godlike in making light of somebody committing suicide. There have been other horrible stories, like people using, this is a text messaging story, but you remember the young lady who was texting a boyfriend or something, encouraging him to commit suicide. Suicide rates have not declined, they've gone up because of social media. And so it's very dangerous in that regard, and it has a lot to do with the hatred and cruelty. And you can look back, if you weren't here for that class, you can look back on our video on cyberbullying, which we spent a lot of time on. I just want to go over some passages of Scripture. Let's read them together. I'll ask you to help me read these. Ephesians 4:32, somebody get that one. And then somebody pick up Colossians 3:12 and 13. Somebody else read for me Colossians 4, verse 6. And then finally, somebody get 1 Peter 3:8. Okay, so Does somebody have Ephesians 4:32?
I got it.
Okay, Bob?
And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you.
All right, thank you. What about Colossians 3:12 and 13? Go ahead, Ron.
Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive.
All right, Colossians 4:6.
Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person.
All right, and then finally, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8.
Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, tender heart, and a humble mind.
Okay, so how can those passages be reconciled with the hatred and cruelty, not just on social media, but in the world today? I mean, Christians should be the kindest, most thoughtful, compassionate, forgiving, patient, forbearing people on the planet. We start, here, but we also ought to show that kind of care and concern for our neighbors around us, coworkers, and people in the community. Anybody want to say anything else about hatred and cruelty before we move on?
I was
Yeah,
just
Ron.
going to say that I think it's the allure of, I guess you could say the emboldening of people to be able to say such terrible things, knowing that they're across a computer screen, that if you were face to face, number one, you probably wouldn't say it because there would be a fight about saying something so terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they feel emboldened that I'm at a distance where there's nothing you can do
Not
to
just,
reply.
I agree with you on the fight, but it's not just the fight, but other reactions like just seeing how much you hurt the other person,
Yeah.
seeing how crushed they are, seeing the wind taken out of their sails, so to speak. That also could shame you, and sometimes that's more hurtful to the person causing harm than the fight reaction. But either way, without those nonverbal cues and without knowing the whole person on the other end, you're emboldened, like you said, to be meaner and more hostile and just not treat others like human beings. It's something we all have to watch out for. Yeah, Jim.
Why does it seem to be inherent in people? I've seen people like, you see somebody that's trying to get out of like maybe a fast food place on Moody Parkway, and it seems like, you're there, you see all these people in front of you, and there's like, nobody's gonna let them out. And it's like, you actually, if you're on the receiving end of that, sometimes you can see the facial, expressions of people, and they're getting delight out of not letting you out. But then there's that one person that slows down and flashes their lights and lets you out. It's like, but it just seems like there's so many people that won't let you out. And I feel like that kind of thought process is the same. It's like, I'm gonna do what I can to get under your skin, because I'm gonna get delight out of getting under your skin, and there's nothing you can do about it.
It's a widespread problem, but you notice I put this first on the list. We're going to talk about sexual immorality next, but when I said morality, what's the first area that you probably thought of? Sexual immorality and impurity. Do we usually think of hatred and cruelty as a morality problem? Most of you probably do, but have you also personally, or have you heard people actually champion something? They may not call it hatred and cruelty, but champion anger, hatred, cruelty, violence, bad temper. Yeah, we hear that all the time. Well, I told that person off. You should have seen me. Man, I got angry. You should have seen me yell at that ref. Whatever. And we admire that kind of stuff, and we laugh at that kind of stuff. And we don't categorize it as a moral problem. But it is a moral problem. And that's why we just read all those passages from the New Testament. It's anti-Christian. And so we've got to start seeing it that way if we're going to see any changes. It's a very common problem. Malia.
And as there's more and more on the internet, social media, we used to kind of keep ourselves in check.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever if you're involved in this like children, and you're doing it on the internet, where will the boundaries be? Because you're used to doing it, so you're going to blast
it's like you're practicing in a simulator on your computer, learning bad habits, bad speech, and then you go out in the real world and you're good at it already. Yeah, I haven't thought about that, but that's a really great point.
We're learning that behavior, but our children are growing up knowing that is their only behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's that
there's a whole
generation coming up, it's
generation
different from
coming up
us.
That isn't gonna know the idea of being nice and cordial, friendly and open and engaging.
Yeah.
They're gonna know the backbiting, back-talking, evil side of things, because that's what social media is full of.
I still gotta believe, though, that parents have more influence than computers. I know a lot of sociologists will disagree with that, but what hope is there if we don't?
But you also have to think that it's not just the people that are doing these actions, such as a fight or whatever, that's actually in the fight. It's the people that are videoing it and posting it. Hey, look at this.
Yeah,
look
passing it
how-"
around.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
so that attitude, and the problem is they're not seeing that as insightful
Mhm.
of the hatred or the cruelty. It's more of, hey, look what, I wasn't involved, but you were there.
Yeah,
and
can you believe this?
encouraged
It's
it.
just like a thing that, a sensational thing that entertains us.
Mhm.
Case in point, what happened over in Hoover, before the parents could even get notified that it was their son laying on the ground, dead, people were posting videos of the dead body and listing
That's
names
exactly
all
the
over
kind of thing,
social
yeah.
media to let everyone know who it was, and the parents had not even been properly notified at that point.
That's how she found out.
Yeah, yeah, that's a perfect example of this kind of thing. All right, let's move on to some of these other matters. And then I had slides on all those that I did not use. Sexual immorality and impurity. I guess we need to say, first of all, that temptation is not the sin of sexual immorality. In the world, in the real world, and on the internet, you can accidentally, unintentionally come into contact with something that is tempting, and then you can avoid the temptation. And that's not a sin, that is a successful defeat of temptation. But the pursuit of temptation is sin. Going after it, looking for it. And that is something that happens a lot on the internet. A great verse on this is Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. Jesus says, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. There are other ways that's translated, but I think that is a very good translation because it has that word intent in it, which is the idea that Jesus is getting across. It's not, coming across something or noticing something or accidentally finding yourself in front of a pornography rack at a gas station or something like that. But it's looking for that, and that's something that people do a lot more of these days because of the internet. Is that not true? So we start out that way, just seeing something and then avoiding it immediately. That's not sinful. Jesus was tempted, according to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, but he didn't sin. So temptation is not the sin, but pursuing temptation or pursuing lust, that's a very sinful thing. And it leads, of course, to all manner of other sins as well. So what can we do to avoid the pursuit and avoid giving in to temptation, etc.? Well, there's several things that we can do here to keep our purity intact. Number one, make a covenant with your eyes. This is a great verse from Job. Job 31, verse 1. I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then, Job says, could I gaze at a virgin? So, and I tell this to young people when I get a chance to talk to them about it, if you're struggling with lust, ask yourself to begin with, have I ever in prayer promised the Lord that I will not look at pornography or that I will not lust after things or pursue lust? Have I ever made that promise to the Lord? And 9 times out of 10, a person will say, no, I've never done that. And there's a reason why people are reluctant to do that. They're reluctant to do that because deep down inside of their heart, they really don't want to stop looking at things that they shouldn't be looking at. When you're ready to do that, you will make a promise to the Lord. And once you make that promise, you will be much more serious about keeping yourself pure. Make a covenant with your eyes. That's why Job was the man that he was, because he was fully committed to righteousness. Wow. Okay, I'll move through these quickly because I want to talk about this last one. Number 2, do your best to avoid sinful influences. Proverbs 4:14 and 15 give us a good formula. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil. Avoid it, do not go on it, turn away from it and pass on. I wanted to talk about this one for a while regarding social media, because sometimes you keep seeing stuff pop up in your news feed that's ugly, or maybe it's sexual immorality, maybe it's just hateful, and maybe it's just bad influences in some other direction. Just unfollow that person. That's following Proverbs 4:14 in the 21st century. Just unfollow them. Get it out. You can choose who you look at. You can curate your own newsfeed. Number 3, run. This was the method suggested by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:18. It's the method used by Joseph at Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife was pursuing him. He just ran. Had to leave his coat, and he suffered some consequences for it, but he didn't sin. He didn't sin against God. Finally, when you fail, repent. You're going to sin from time to time. Hopefully less as you mature, less and less and less. But when you do sin, don't tell yourself, I'm just going to keep doing this. Repent, leave the past behind you, and move forward. That's the biblical response. Real quickly, let me get into profanity. Like my image? That guy is cussing up a blue streak right there, that baboon. Profanity, I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed, a coarsening of language. And I think a lot of it goes back to the absence of any controls on the internet. Kids are streaming their TV and their music, and of course they're looking at social media, and there's nothing on there controlling the language and the content. Have you noticed this? If you use music streaming services, Spotify, what are they? Spotify, Amazon, iTunes, there's no holds barred on there. And, on the radio at least, maybe they'll bleep something out from time to time. But on the internet, they don't have to, so they don't, which makes the artist, if you want to call them that, the artists say, hey, nobody's controlling this, nobody's going to bleep my stuff, so I'm going to put more adult, mature content into it, and it gets worse because of no regulations. So I've been noticing a coarsening of this, and young people are more and more comfortable with bad language these days. I think more so than when I was growing up. I don't know, that's a pretty subjective point of view. So how do we tell kids, and this is the hard thing, how do you tell kids that certain words are wrong? How do we tell each other? How do we understand the problem with profanity? And I have to do this really quickly. The Bible's teaching on profanity is that it's inappropriate. Okay? So that's something your mom said. Don't do that. Why? It's inappropriate. And so we've kind of lost what that means. But what that means is language, words mean things, and culture and society assigns meaning to them. And a culture, of all things, actually tells us which words are vulgar and which words aren't, based on the kind of reaction you get from them. And so there are some words that are inappropriate because culture says this is what you say for shock value. This is what you say to get attention in the wrong way. This is what you say to tell somebody that you hate their guts. This is what you say to express that you're angry or whatever. And these things are inappropriate. Now, I was thinking about this. I was talking to somebody one day about it, and to really illustrate, I can't do this, but I think I could illustrate inappropriate language really well if I got up in the pulpit on Sunday morning and said like some of the worst cuss words that were ever imagined. I think people would be shocked. But if they turned on their television set, they could watch that all day long and never be shocked by it. Why? Because in one case a preacher's saying it, but in the other case it's somebody that they expect to say it. Well, what are they responding to there? It's inappropriate. So if it's inappropriate for you know, a preacher to say it. It's inappropriate for anybody to say it, right? I'm going to be facing the same judge at the end of time as everybody else. So you start thinking about it that way. I could really illustrate that, but then I'd lose my job and I'd make one last point and that'd be it for me. So I'm not going to do it.
would go viral on social media.
It would go viral for sure. And I would say, I was just trying to explain profanity, but it wouldn't be as good. So how do you just convince people by saying it's inappropriate? I don't know, but there's a biblical case for this I didn't have time to get into. Read Ephesians the end of chapter 4, and read Ephesians 5, 1 through 11, and count how many times Paul says, it's not proper. That's something Christians shouldn't do. You do it to your shame. It is out of place. What is he saying in all those? He's saying it's improper and you shouldn't do it. So that's all we had time for with morality. I appreciate your patience this evening and look forward to getting into something new next week.